In the Studio is sponsored this week by Head & Shoulders, Brute, and by the U.S. Marines.
Doc, you did some time in the cat jail for the left hand. You didn't like the way your tan was in the morning.
Excuse me, is this thing on?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
You're welcome.
Guitar up.
1,
Turn
2,
that guitar
3.
up.
Hi, and welcome to In the Studio. I'm Redbeard, bringing you the stories behind the greatest rock and roll albums in history. Today, we'll go in the studio with the progressive rock band that scorned the accepted rules of the day to score a top 3 album that contained only 3 songs.
Close to the end, down by the river. Seasons will pass you by. Get up, get down.
I think there was a unified feeling about doing Close to the Edge that was a moment in time. It never happened again and never will happen again the way that happened. It was the weather, it was London, it was Advision Studios, it was the atmosphere. It was a collective knowledge that we were embarking on something a little bit new, a little bit uncharted territory. And I think that's one of the things that make Close to the Edge as perennial as it is. Hello, this is John Anderson of Yes.
Hi, this is Rick Wakeman of Yes.
Hello, this is Bill Bruford of Yes.
And this is Steve Howe of Yes, and you're in the studio for the 1972 Close to the Edge experience.
For the first dozen years of rock and roll, it was generally accepted that pop songs should be no longer than 3.5 minutes. Anything beyond that, it was believed, would be lost on the short attention span of the record-buying public. But in the late 60s, a few years after the initial British invasion, a second wave of English rock bands challenged this standard. The simple rule of this new movement, dubbed art rock or progressive rock, was that there were no rules. By 1972, Yes was at the apex of this avant-garde movement. Melding their unbelievably diverse influences, Yes of the early 70s created a unique style that has been best described as sound painting. During their most innovative period, the musical painters were singer John Anderson, guitarist Steve Howe, drummer Bill Bruford, bass player Chris Squire, and keyboardist Rick Wakeman. In the fall of 1972, Yes released Close to the Edge, just 9 months after their breakthrough album Fragile, which had clearly proven that commercial acceptance could be achieved without compromising Yes's musical integrity. Excited by their newfound popularity, Yes went back in the studio with producer Eddie Offord and painstakingly recorded Close to the Edge, in between concerts on their Fragile tour. As Rick Wakeman recalls, it was a phenomenal period for Yes.
Well, my recollection at the time was that of a certain amount of power, because you knew that just the way that record company and managements and people around you reacted. The best way I can describe it is if you're a successful comedian, people will laugh at your jokes even if they're not funny. And people started to gather round us like the proverbial bees round a honey pot, or flies round a honey pot, whichever you like to call them. Really.
You knew you were hot.
Oh yeah, you knew you were hot. You knew you had something. The strange thing was, I don't think any of us really, to be brutally honest, knew quite what it was. The thing that we'd done on Fragile was break a lot of rules. We'd broken a lot of rules with pieces, especially like Heart of the Sunrise and Roundabout, with having lots of different tempos, moods, times, everything that you shouldn't really do on a rock record, we did. And the great thing was for us that America loved it. It was tremendous. You knew you had something special to offer. It was very strange. But the other great thing as well was we as musicians were ahead of the technology, and we were ahead of the studios, and we were ahead of the record company and management, who had no idea really where we were going, but knew, to put it crudely, that it was making their money, so let them get on with it. And that was the secret of Yes, and we knew it. There was an interesting thing about a lot of the music at that time, and it shows up now, that the music, pieces like And You and I, Close to the Edge, were bigger than the band. They were more important than the band or any individual. They were more powerful than the band. There are certain pieces of Yes music that are in control of you rather than you being in control of it. And You and I is undoubtedly one of them. Close to the Edge for me is another, and Awaken is another. So it's amazing to have two such pieces on one album.
That's the title track of Yes's 1972 release, Close to the Edge. Up next, we'll find out what inspired the lyrics to that incredible piece of music. I'm Redbeard, and you're in the studio with Yes, Close to the Edge.
What's a plaque mouth? A plaque mouth is a lonely mouth. Get close up any plaque formula. Not a plaque mouth.
Welcome back in the studio. I'm Steve Howe of Yes with Redbeard.
Thank you, Steve. You know, these days it's quite common for record companies and management to frequently visit rock bands in the studio, offering advice and suggestions. But as John Anderson and Rick Wakeman remember it, one of the reasons Yes was able to be experimental and adventurous with Close to the Edge was because during the whole recording process, Yes's record label left them virtually alone.
Close to the Edge, the record company that didn't come near nobody came near
So Phil
the
came
studio.
down, Phil came down a couple of times, but they had no idea what was
They had
going
no
on.
idea how long we were doing this piece of music, and what did it all mean, and You and I, and True and things like that.
Very funny, actually.
It was just a remarkable time of freedom. The interesting thing that we aspired to at that time was to create music that hadn't been thought of before, music that hadn't been heard before. It wasn't any retro anything. It was based on our collective talents, using a spiritual theme, because Close to the Edge is close to the edge of realization, of self-realization. That's what the theme was all about. It was all based on a book that I had read called Siddhartha from Hermann Hesse. So there we were on the edge of learning about our potential as artists, as musicians, in order to, jump into a new world of music. And that's what Close to the Edge was all about. And it did push us in a direct fashion into the limelight of, one could say, total progressive music, to the point that today we can perform nearly 20 years later, And You and I, and it still, in fact, now has more power than it ever had.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable piece of music, as though it was crafted by the heavens, and we were just the vehicles in order to pull it together.
Left to their own devices, Yes charted their own course, undaunted by then-current musical trends. As rock writer Joe Benson put it, with Close to the Edge, Yes was traveling in a territory all their own. Supremely confident that their fans were up to the musical journey and lasting as long as an entire side of an album, Yes challenged their audience to accompany them. Their confidence did not go unrewarded. Within a month of its release, Close to the Edge hit number 3 on the American album charts, the highest position ever attained by Yes. Clearly, in 1972, Yes was way ahead of their time. Here's Rick Wakeman.
And the great thing is, if you stay way ahead of the game, then to a certain extent the people around you are frightened and will let you carry on. And that's where Yes was. Yes, at that time as a band, was so far ahead of the game that all around couldn't get involved because they didn't understand what was going on. It was tremendous. It was a phenomenal period of time. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't really understand what was going on. And I don't think any of us did. We all like to believe we did. But a number of times I got asked questions like, well, how do you put together music like this? And the best you could come up with is, well, it's a catalytic element. Music is the catalytic element of 5 completely different characters that all happen to be put together to work musically. With different ideas, different upbringings, different musical backgrounds, all capable of playing, and the music ends up as the catalytic element. And that was the sort of the best that anybody could really come up with, because nobody really knew.
Indeed, it is amazing to consider just how Yes was putting together these lengthy pieces. First of all, contrary to what you might expect of symphonic arrangements such as Yes was doing on Close to the Edge, none of it was written out. Secondly, the group's main songwriter, John Anderson, was the one member who had no formal musical training. Instead, Anderson had the enviable gift of being able to hear melodies in his head. The challenge then was how to present these songs to the rest of the band. Drummer Bill Bruford explains.
Usually he presented them with a great deal of vigor, a great deal of muscle, and a great deal of, if you don't like it, think of something better. That usually was John's approach. So he would play something really horrendously terrible. And most people would say, oh, do we have to play this? Oh, no. Well, all right, if we've got to, why don't you put the sixth there in the chord and play it like that? And then somebody would say, yeah, but if you put an F in the bass instead of the G root, then it'll sound better, and you see what happens. The original idea would become turned into music by the four competent musicians around him. So he would bang out some horrendous, god-awful noise over one chord, getting his fingers caught in the strings, with a look in his eyes which said, if you don't like this, quit or make it better. Which is a technique, that Hitler would use, somewhere slightly to the right of Hitler. And of course, people would say, oh, do I have to leave the group? No. All right, well, let's tell him that if you move the G6 to the G minor 6, then it'll sound really good, And so that's what would happen. And then somebody would say, well, that sounds quite good. And hey, presto, the ball is up and running. Often used by band leaders in some way or another. It's throwing down a gauntlet saying, I'm doing this. If you guys can like it, or you can leave it, or you can improve it. So we'd improve it.
From Close to the Edge, that's Yes, with the enigmatic titled Siberian Katru. When we come back, we'll get the inside scoop on how Yes arranged their incredibly complex music in the early 70s. I'm Redbeard, and you're in the studio with Yes for Close to the Edge.
What's a plaque mouth? A plaque mouth is a lonely...
Welcome back to In the Studio. This week we're discussing Close to the Edge. I'm Rick Wakeman, and now back to Redbeard.
Thank you, Rick. As I mentioned earlier, Yes did not score their musical arrangements ahead of time. Instead, Chris Squire, John Anderson, Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, and Bill Bruford would sit around banging it out one chord at a time. Can you imagine how tedious this process would get in putting together a 10-minute tune like And You and I? That a band like Yes was making music in this way astounds me. However, Bill Bruford says it shouldn't.
What should astound you is the sheer lunacy of trying to attempt such a thing. And if, of course, we'd known how horrible it was going to be, we would never have done it. But it's like five guys trying to write a novel at the same time. One guy has a good beginning, and the second guy has quite a good middle, and the third guy thinks he knows what the ending is, but the fourth guy doesn't like the middle, and he doesn't like the way the middle goes towards the ending. And the second guy, who used to like the third section, has changed his mind and now likes the first section. You see what I mean? It's obviously a nightmare, and very sensibly people now don't have the time or inclination to work at music that way. So it was a very unusual way to do it.
Yes, guitarist Steve Howe.
But I remember the sort of chaos that we were in within You and I. We had this song before we knew what happened after da 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 da. Three of those. It was like going somewhere, and we were all going, but where? And I remember we had, like Amen, Amen. We had this two chords at the end, and the idea was that the first chord was just going to go on for an indefinite sort of vanilla fudge sort of length, where you're just going to like hold this chord and everybody was going to boogie on one chord, man, groove on a chord, There's no rhythm, there's just, and so it got to be like, these people were trying to sustain this note, and keyboards were hammering this note, and Bill was most probably hitting something. And then eventually, like with great relief, it went, and we listened to this a few times and kind of, well, that's great ending. It's a good ending. It's not a bad ending. It's an average ending. It's a pretty lousy ending. So gradually its popularity diminished, and John and I went out there with voice and guitar and sort of did a shape for an ending. We didn't have an end. So in a way we were it was almost the blind leading the blind. But this thing, as Bill said, the fact that we didn't know how good what we were doing is almost what enabled us to be very progressive, very explorative. It made it more exciting because we were all so stupid in those days. We were all so, I was going to say dumb, but I don't know how you'd express it. We were just green, that's it. We say in England green, wet behind the ears. We didn't know what we were doing, and this was the marvellous expedition that we were on.
It was torture. None of us. These arrangements weren't written, so no, and they weren't really composed. So that we all sat in a rehearsal room and said, "Well, let's have a G after the G sharp," and every instrument was up for democratic election, and everybody had to run an election campaign on every issue, and it was horrible. I mean, it was incredibly unpleasant and unbelievably hard work, and Squire was always late, of course, to every rehearsal. And after about 2 months of this.
Yeah, months.
I mean,
we
months.
used to do this as punishment.
It was unbelievable punishment, and people say, why Bill? To me, Bill, why didn't you do another one? I mean, do you understand why I didn't do another one? I wasn't going to go through that again. It was horrible. It was torture.
But there again, we were on the cusp, or the scent of something bigger than Yes had ever been before, which was the scale of the music in Close to the Edge.
Coming quickly to terms of all expression made with you.
In those days, we were making music and we'd stop when it was finished, look at each other and say, well, that's great, what is it? And they'll say, hey, that's 12 minutes long. Wow. Well, we'll just tighten that up a bit. And, hey, it's 10 minutes long. Wow. We were more surprised than anybody that it was long. We just made music until it was finished.
So I can play you lots of music from that era that's 10 minutes long from other people and things, as pile of junk. I can play you 3-minute pieces of music in the piles of junk. What counts is a piece of music that counts for every minute that it's there.
Yeah, you let it happen.
We never timed anything, as John said, at the end of it. How long was that? And Eddie might go, well, that's 6.5 minutes, and you're only at the end of the first verse.
Sad preacher nailed upon the colored door of time.
I think there was a unified feeling about doing Close to the Edge that was a moment in time. It never happened again and never will happen again the way that happened. It was the weather, it was London, it was Advision Studios, it was the atmosphere. It was a collective knowledge that we were embarking on something a little bit new, a little bit uncharted territory. And I think that's one of the things that make Close to the Edge as perennial as it is.
And you and I clear crossing the shapes of the morning. And you and I reach over the sun for the river. And you and I glide clearer towards the movement. And you and I gold over valleys of endless sea.
The breathtaking song called And You and I from Yes, Close to the Edge. We'll be right back in the studio after this.
He can be
If you'd like to hear your favorite CD featured on In the Studio, please write your suggested artist and title on a postcard and mail it to In the Studio, Post Office Box 6190, Burbank, California, 91505. Be sure to include your name, address, and phone number. If we draw your card, you'll receive a copy of that CD free, courtesy of Kelly LeBrock and Brute, The Essence of Man. Hundreds of runner-up entries will also receive free Brute cologne. This is Redbeard, and I'd like to thank John Anderson, Bill Bruford, Steve Howe, and Rick Wakeman of Yes for taking us so close to the edge. And diehard Yes fans will be happy to know that Yes Years, the definitive 4-CD Yes box set, has now been released. Special thanks to Alex Scott of East End Management and to Malcolm Craggs. You can write to us in the studio at Post Office Box 6190, Burbank, California, 91510. In the Studio is a Bullet production produced by yours truly, Redbeard, and Jim Nelson. Written by Jim Nelson. Production assistance and editing by Digital Master Rick R.J. Lane. The executive producer of In the Studio is Stephen R. Smith. This week, we get incredibly close to the edge in the studio.
Close to the end, down by the river. Seasons will pass you by. Get up, get down.
I think there was a unified feeling about doing Close to the Edge that was a moment in time. It never happened again and never will happen again the way that happened. It was the weather, it was London, it was Vision Studios, it was the atmosphere. It was a collective knowledge that we were embarking on something a little bit new, a little bit uncharted territory. And I think that's one of the things that make Close to the Edge as perennial as it is. Hello, this is John Anderson of Yes.
Hi, this is Rick Wakeman of Yes.
Hello, this is Bill Bruford of Yes.
And this is Steve Howard, Yes, and you're in the studio for the 1972 Close to the Edge experience.